But today I want to begin with a train journey. Um, the time is early 1993, and I was traveling south and east, going from Vienna to Budapest on the train. And what I remember most about that trip is, not a particular station, though Budapest was very memorable at the time, and a particular building or a particular conversation. What I remember was color. Or more precisely, the apparent disappearance of colour. So as the train crossed the border into Hungary, it felt as though someone had turned down the saturation on the world. The farmland seemed greyer, the houses fewer, the visual density diminished. The entire landscape appeared flattened somehow. And then, a few days later, after a wonderful time in Budapest, traveling back towards Austria, the reverse happened. The colours came back, came rushing back. And I remember sitting there almost overwhelmed by it. The reds, the greens, the fields, the vibrancy, the visual abundance. And I felt like somebody had fixed the television that had been stuck in black and white. At the time, I experienced this as perception. 3 decades later, I understand it differently. I understand it as politics. Because the Eastern Bloc was not simply a collection of countries that happened to develop differently. It existed inside a geopolitical enclosure. It restricted access to capital, restricted access to markets, restricted access to the dollar system that increasingly structures global exchange. So whatever one thinks about the success or failures in 20th century socialism, these societies were operating under conditions not entirely of their own choosing. The colour had politics behind it. The landscape had history behind it. And the sensory experience was real because the cause extended far beyond from what I can see from the train window. And I did not expect that memory to return to me here in, the modern times, but it did. Right? In 2023, if you can follow with me here, I encountered the work of Anne Peters, Berry Prezant, and Marc Blanc. And once again, I felt colour returning. No visual colour, conceptual colour, explanatory colour. The colour that arrives when a pattern you have lived your entire life suddenly acquires language. So, as many of you know, my original diagnosis was Asperger's disorder under DSM-4. And at that point, I was already in my 30s. I had spent decades navigating educational systems, workplaces, relationships, universities, professional environments. I had documentation of language difficulties, documentation of communication challenges, documentation of processing differences. I held college degrees. Eventually, in my late 40s, I completed a PhD. And through all of this, nobody, not a single person, ever mentioned gestalt processing. Nobody mentioned that there might be different processing architectures. Nobody mentioned that language might arrive differently. And nobody mentioned that some people encounter wholes before parts. Nobody mentioned Peter's distinction between analytic and gestalt processors. Nothing. I discovered it accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally, perhaps through the strange kind of resonance that occurs when the field finally finds language for itself. I stumbled across the work. I started reading. And with the hours, decades of experience began reorganizing themselves. Not because the experiences changed, because the framework changed. The colour came rushing back. One of the things that fascinates me now is that Peters was talking about these distinctions in the 1970s, nearly 50 years ago. Think about that. The information existed, the concepts existed, the observations existed, the people existed. What didn't exist was distribution. What did not exist was access. And what did not exist is a pathway connecting that knowledge to people like me. And that matters. Because when knowledge remains trapped inside professional silos, the practical effect is often indistinguishable from absence. A thing can exist, and it can still be inaccessible. A thing can be true, and still never arrive. A thing can be sitting in a journal article for half a century and never reach the people who most need it. The field existed. The pathways did not. So looking back, I see this pattern everywhere, including my doctoral program. I completed my doctorate eventually. It took 7.5 years, nearly twice the normal completion time. Long enough that I had to receive institutional permission to continue beyond year 6. At the time, I had no language whatsoever for why everything seemed so difficult. I understood that I was struggling. I didn't understand the nature of the struggle. My advanced quantitative methods courses provide the perfect example. And most people describe these courses as learning statistics. That's not what happened for me. For me, I was learning statistics whilst simultaneously learning IBM's SPSS software system. 2 systems, 2 languages, 2 representation frameworks. Nobody seemed to recognize that these were separate tasks. The instructors treated SPSS as though they were transparent, as though it were merely a tool, as though learning the statistics and learning the software were effectively the same thing. But for me, they were not. I had to understand the statistical concepts, then understand the software, then build a bridge between them, then test whether the bridge was correct, then translate back and forth again and again. I spent thousands of dollars on tutors because I lack intelligence, motivation, or work ethic. I spent thousands because I was attempting to construct translation infrastructure that nobody around me realized I needed. There were semesters when I stopped, and not because I was done, because I needed time to learn the language itself. Time to build enough structure that the next layer could attach. And through all of this, nobody ever suggested that the problem might be architectural. The assumption was always individual. Work harder, study more, get tutoring, take additional time, try again. The support that arrived was always remedial, never explanatory. Eventually, I had to dismiss my dissertation chair. I know that sounds dramatic, but it was. She repeatedly provided incorrect guidance again and again, and at some point it became impossible to continue. So I removed her and found a path forward. I finished. I earned the doctorate. The institution saw success. I saw survival. And for years, that was a story, a difficult doctorate, a long doctorate, a doctorate completed despite obstacles. Then I discovered gestalt processing. And suddenly the entire thing looked different. The events remained identical, the timeline identical, the costs identical, but the interpretation changed. I was no longer looking at a collection of unrelated struggles. I was looking at a single pattern expressed through many environments. The problem had never been statistics or SPSS or a dissertation chair or a graduate school or autism. The problem was translation. The problem was architecture. The problem was I was operating inside systems built upon assumptions nobody recognized as assumptions. And this, I think, is where the politics enters. Because when we hear the word politics, many of us imagine elections, parties, government, legislation. But politics is also about access. Who gets access to resources? Who gets access to language? Who gets access to explanations, to legitimacy, to reality itself? The Eastern Bloc experienced material enclosure. Gestalt processing experienced epistemic enclosure. Knowledge became concentrated. Access became restricted. Alternative frameworks became marginal, not necessarily through conspiracy, not necessarily through malice. Systems do not require villains to produce exclusion. They merely require incentives. And behaviorism had incentives, enormous incentives, professional incentives, institutional, financial, certification and research incentives. Entire industries emerged around particular understanding of autism. And once that occurs, alternative frameworks face extraordinary barriers. Not because they're necessarily wrong, but because existing structures have already captured the territory. The market has been enclosed. And then social media arrives and reproduces the pattern again. The algorithms favor brevity, visuality, speed, shareability, pretty faces, strong certainty, rapid emotional reward. The platforms are not designed for 5,000 word essays. They're certainly not designed for 55 years of accumulated gestalt experience. When I encounter autistic spaces online, I often see experiences that are entirely real, entirely valid, and often profoundly analytic. And that makes sense. Analytic processing is more common. Analytic communication aligns more easily with platform incentives. And the result is not that gestalt processors like me disappear. The result is that we become harder to see. Again, when I offer someone an article, a framework, a historical account, a theoretical explanation, I often hear the same response. It's too much reading. And I understand that, I truly do. But sometimes I find myself wondering what alternative is being proposed. How do you compress 5 decades of lived experience into a meme? How do you explain delayed knowing in an infographic? How do you explain perceiving relational fields before discrete objects? And how do you explain an entire architecture of cognition in 30 seconds? Some things require space, require accumulation, require enough language for the pattern to emerge. This is one reason I write long essays. And not because I enjoy verbosity, quite the opposite. I would love for a meme to do the job. I would love for a single sentence to accomplish it. But some experiences only become visible through duration. Some patterns only emerge when enough pieces accumulate. A gestalt is, by definition, larger than its components. The whole arrives before the explanation. The recognition arrives before the vocabulary. The knowing arrives before the proof. Now, for many years, I possessed the experience. What I lacked was the language. And that may be the central point I want to leave with you today. The colour was there all along. The colour was present in Hungary. The colour was present in my doctorate. The colour was present in my autism diagnosis. The colour was present in every language struggle I could explain. The colour was present in every accommodation I required but couldn't name. The colour was present in every tutor, every delay, every misunderstanding, every unnecessary detour. The colour was present. What was missing was access. What was missing was language. What was missing was a framework capable of revealing what had already been there. And perhaps that is the most important lesson gestalt processing has given me. Sometimes discovery is not the arrival of something new. Sometimes discovery is the collapse of an enclosure, the opening of a gate, the removal of a border. The moment when an entire landscape suddenly becomes visible, not because it changed, but because you finally gain permission to see it. So, thank you, and good day.